A 16-year-old girl screams as poison burns through her veins while her stepmother watches with satisfaction. The beautiful Margarete von Waldeck would become the inspiration for Snow White, but her real story ends not with a prince's kiss, but with a gruesome death that shocked medieval Germany. The reality is far more disturbing. This beloved fairy tale hides one of the most psychologically twisted murder cases in European history, wrapped in child labor exploitation, ritualistic killing, and a society so obsessed with beauty that it literally drove people to murder. The brothers Grimm collected this tale from real German folklore, stories passed down through generations who witnessed the actual events. Behind a magic mirror lies a world of medieval brutality where children were worked to death in mines, where stepmothers regularly poisoned their rivals, and where proving someone's death required cutting out their heart. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see this classic fairy tale, because sometimes the most twisted stories are the ones that really happened. Chapter 1. The Beauty That Killed. In 1533, in the rolling hills of Bavaria, a child was born whose beauty would eventually cause her death. Margarete von Waldeck entered the world as the daughter of Count Philip IV von Waldeck, a powerful nobleman in the Holy Roman Empire. From her earliest years, Margaret possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that medieval chroniclers described as otherworldly and blessed by angels. But in 16th century Germany, extraordinary beauty was not a blessing. It was a curse. Margaret's mother died when she was young, and her father quickly remarried a woman named Katharina von Hatzfeld. Contemporary accounts describe Katharina as intelligent, ambitious, and ruthlessly concerned with her own children's prospects. She saw Margaret not as a stepdaughter, but as a threat. The girl's beauty was already attracting attention from nobles across the Germanic states, attention that could elevate her far above Katharina's own children. The relationship between stepmother and stepdaughter deteriorated rapidly. Katharina became obsessed with Margaret's appearance, reportedly spending hours studying her own reflection in polished metal mirrors while comparing herself to the younger woman. Medieval German society placed enormous importance on physical beauty as a marker of divine favor and social worth. For Katharina, Margaret's superior beauty represented not just personal humiliation, but a threat to her family's entire future. When Margaret turned 16, Katharina convinced her husband to send the girl away to the court of her brother-in-law in Brussels. The official reason was education and social refinement. The real reason was removal of a rival. Margaret was essentially exiled from her own home, sent to live among strangers in a foreign court where she knew no one and had no protection. But Margaret's beauty followed her to Brussels. She quickly became the center of attention, courted by nobles from across Europe. This success only intensified Katharina's jealousy. Letters from the period reveal a woman consumed by envy and rage. When spreading rumors failed, she began exploring more direct solutions. The inspiration for Snow White's magic mirror comes from this real obsession. Medieval nobles were fascinated by their reflections. Polished metal mirrors were expensive status symbols, and spending excessive time studying one's appearance was considered both vain and potentially dangerous. Katharina's mirror obsession became legendary among the servants at Waldeck Castle. They reported that she would spend hours each day examining her reflection, often asking them to confirm her beauty compared to Margaret's. The psychological pressure was immense. These servants, dependent on noble favor for their survival, were forced to participate in a twisted game of validation that grew more desperate as Margaret's reputation spread. In Brussels, Margaret encountered the real-life inspiration for the Seven Dwarfs. The region was home to extensive copper and silver mines, worked primarily by children and adolescents whose growth had been stunted by malnutrition and dangerous working conditions. These young miners, rarely growing taller than 4 feet, lived in communal housing near the mines. Their pale skin, damaged by lack of sunlight and toxic exposure, and their prematurely aged faces gave them an otherworldly appearance that both fascinated and disturbed the nobility. Margaret, known for her charitable nature, often visited these mining communities. She brought food, medicine, and comfort to workers who were essentially enslaved by the mining operations. Her kindness to these marginalized people further enhanced her reputation for goodness and divine favor, but also provided her stepmother with the perfect opportunity for murder. The beauty that should have secured Margaret's future instead sealed her fate. In a society where women's worth was measured by their appearance, being too beautiful was as dangerous as being too ugly. Margarete von Waldeck had become a threat that her stepmother could no longer tolerate. The stage was set for one of medieval Germany's most calculated murders. Chapter 2. The Poison Apple and the Art of Murder. The year 1554 marked the end of Margarete von Waldeck's short life, but the manner of her death would echo through German folklore for centuries. In medieval Germany, poison was the weapon of choice for those who needed to kill quietly and without suspicion. The art of poisoning had been perfected over generations, passed down through networks of apothecaries, midwives, and nobles who understood that sometimes murder was the only solution to political or personal problems. Katharina von Hatzfeld had spent months planning her stepdaughter's death. She couldn't simply have Margaret killed outright. That would raise too many questions and potentially implicate her. Instead, she needed something that would appear natural, accidental, or at least untraceable. Poison offered the perfect solution. The most common poison in 16th century Germany was arsenic, readily available from apothecaries as a treatment for various ailments. More sophisticated poisoners used combinations of toxic plants native to German forests, deadly nightshade, foxglove, and yew berries. But Katharina chose a different method, one that would become the central image of the Snow White story. She decided to use cyanide-laced fruit, specifically apples, as her delivery method. Apples held special significance in Germanic culture, symbolizing temptation, knowledge, and death. The fruit's association with the biblical fall of humanity made it a psychologically powerful choice for murder. The poison apple wasn't just a fairy tale invention. Medieval poisoners regularly used fruit as a delivery method because the natural sugars could mask bitter tastes, and the act of eating fruit appeared completely innocent. Cyanide, extracted from bitter almonds and cherry pits, was particularly effective because it acted quickly and produced symptoms that resembled sudden illness rather than poisoning. Katharina arranged for the poisoned apples to be delivered to Margaret in Brussels through a network of contacts. The delivery was disguised as a gift from home, a thoughtful gesture from a stepmother who missed her daughter. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Margaret, homesick and isolated in a foreign court, would naturally be eager to receive anything that connected her to her childhood home. Contemporary accounts describe Margaret's final hours in horrific detail. She consumed the poisoned fruit during an evening meal, sharing it with other members of the court. Within hours, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, and convulsions. The cyanide attacked her nervous system, causing her to lose consciousness while her body continued to suffer. The medieval understanding of poison was limited, but the symptoms were unmistakable to those who had seen them before. Margaret's skin took on a bluish tint, a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. Her breathing became labored and irregular. Most disturbing of all, witnesses reported that she remained conscious and aware even as her body shut down, trapped in a failing shell while her mind remained clear. The psychological horror of Margaret's death cannot be overstated. She died knowing she had been murdered, understanding that someone she trusted had planned her destruction. The beautiful young woman who had shown kindness to mining children and charm to European nobility spent her final moments in agony, betrayed by someone who should have protected her. What makes this murder particularly twisted is how it was covered up. Katharina had prepared alibis and explanations well in advance. She spread rumors that Margaret had been acting strangely, suggesting mental illness or spiritual possession. The medieval mind was ready to accept supernatural explanations for unexpected death. The preservation of Margaret's body after death created the inspiration for Snow White's glass coffin. Medieval German customs required that bodies of the nobility be displayed for extended periods before burial, both to allow proper mourning and to provide evidence of death. Margaret's body was treated with preservatives and displayed in a specially constructed glass-windowed coffin, a practice reserved for the most important deaths. The sight of the beautiful young woman lying in state, her skin pale but otherwise unmarked by her ordeal, created a haunting image that would be remembered for generations. Visitors to the castle reported that she appeared to be sleeping rather than dead, contributing to the folklore that would eventually become the sleeping princess awaiting true love's kiss. But there was no prince's kiss for Margarete von Waldeck. There was only a carefully planned murder, executed by a woman whose jealousy had consumed her humanity. The poison apple that killed Snow White was not a magical object wielded by a witch. It was a weapon used by a real woman who had decided that her stepdaughter's beauty was worth destroying, regardless of the cost. Chapter 3. The Seven Dwarfs and Child Labor Horrors. The most disturbing aspect of the Snow White story isn't the evil stepmother or the poison apple. It's the seven dwarfs, because these characters represent one of medieval Germany's most horrific practices, the systematic exploitation and destruction of children through mining labor. The dwarfs who helped Snow White were not magical beings living in a cozy cottage. They were real children whose bodies and lives had been destroyed by an industry that consumed young lives for profit. The Schneeberg region of Germany, where Margarete von Waldeck spent part of her childhood, was home to some of Europe's most productive silver and copper mines. These operations required workers who could fit into narrow tunnels and work in spaces too small for adults. The solution was simple and monstrous. Use children. Boys as young as 8 years old were forced into the mines, where they would spend 12 to 16 hours a day in conditions that would kill most adults within months. The physical transformation of these child miners was systematic and horrific. Constant exposure to toxic minerals stunted their growth and caused permanent deformities. Most mining children never grew taller than 4 feet. Their spines curved from carrying heavy loads. Their skin became pale and sickly from lack of sunlight. The psychological damage was equally severe. Children who entered the mines rarely emerged with their minds intact. The constant fear of cave-ins, the physical agony of poisoning, and the knowledge that they would likely die young created a population of traumatized individuals who had been robbed of their childhood and their future. Many developed the behavioral patterns that would later be romanticized in fairy tales. They became withdrawn, spoke in whispers, and formed tight-knit groups for mutual protection. The cottage in the woods, where Snow White found refuge, was based on the real communal housing provided for mining children. These structures, built near mine entrances, were designed to house as many workers as possible in the smallest space. They were typically single-room buildings where dozens of children slept on straw mattresses, ate communal meals, and tried to recover from their daily ordeal underground. The cleanliness and order that Snow White brought to the dwarf's cottage reflects the real desperation of these mining children for anything resembling normal domestic life. They had been torn from their families and thrust into an industrial nightmare where survival depended on rigid discipline and mutual cooperation. Any adult who showed them kindness or helped maintain their living space would have been treasured and protected. The economic system that created these conditions was both legal and widely accepted. Mining operations were owned by nobles and wealthy merchants who saw child labor as a necessary expense for profitable extraction. The children themselves were often sold into mining contracts by their own families, desperate parents who needed money and had no other options. Once in the mines, these children became property, bought and sold like any other commodity. The mortality rate among mining children was staggering. Most died within 2 years of entering the mines, succumbing to lung diseases, metal poisoning, or accidents. Those who survived longer often developed severe disabilities that left them unable to function in normal society. The fairy tale's portrayal of the dwarfs as happy, singing workers was a grotesque distortion of reality. Real mining children worked in silence. Communication was difficult in the narrow tunnels, and any noise could trigger fatal cave-ins. They didn't sing while they worked. They prayed they would live to see another day. Their supposed happiness was a fiction created by adults who needed to justify their participation in a system that destroyed children for profit. The gifts that the dwarfs gave Snow White in various versions of the story, jewelry, precious metals, and gemstones, represent the real wealth that these children extracted from the earth. Every beautiful object they produced was bought with their blood, their health, and ultimately their lives. The irony is unmistakable. The same industry that created beautiful things for the wealthy also destroyed the children who made such beauty possible. When Margarete von Waldeck visited the mining communities near Brussels, she witnessed this horror firsthand. Her charitable efforts to help these children made her beloved among the mining population, but it also exposed her to the brutal realities of medieval industrial exploitation. The kindness she showed to society's most vulnerable members became part of her legend, but it also highlighted the contrast between the privileged world of the nobility and the nightmare existence of the working class. The seven dwarfs of fairy tale fame were not magical helpers. They were the broken survivors of a system that consumed children and discarded their remains. They represent one of humanity's darkest chapters, when entire societies agreed that some children's lives were worth less than the metals they could extract from the earth. The cottage in the woods was not a refuge from evil. It was a monument to society's willingness to sacrifice the innocent for profit. Chapter 4. The Huntsman's Heart and Ritualistic Murder. The most psychologically disturbing element of the Snow White story is not the poison or the exploited children. It's the huntsman's heart, because this seemingly symbolic detail reveals the ritualistic nature of medieval murder and the twisted psychology of those who ordered it. The demand for Snow White's heart was not a fairy tale invention. It was based on real Germanic practices of proving death and a medieval obsession with possessing pieces of murdered victims. In the original Brothers Grimm version, the evil stepmother orders a huntsman to kill Snow White and bring back her heart as proof of death. This wasn't symbolic storytelling. It was an accurate reflection of how contract killings operated in medieval Germany. Professional killers were expected to provide physical evidence of their success, and internal organs were the preferred proof because they could not be faked or substituted. The huntsman's psychological profile reveals the complex moral landscape of medieval murder. These men were not simple criminals. They were skilled professionals who operated within a system that sanctioned killing under certain circumstances. Many huntsmen were former soldiers or executioners who had been trained to kill efficiently and without emotional attachment. They understood anatomy, they knew how to cause death quickly, and they had been conditioned to view killing as a job rather than a moral choice. The heart held special significance in Germanic culture and medieval Christianity. It was believed to be the seat of the soul, the organ that contained a person's essence and spiritual identity. Possessing someone's heart was thought to give the owner power over that person's spirit, even after death. This belief system transformed the huntsman's task from simple murder into a form of spiritual conquest. Katharina von Hatzfeld's demand for Margaret's heart reveals a level of psychological disturbance that goes beyond jealousy or practical concerns. She didn't just want her stepdaughter dead. She wanted to possess part of her, to literally own the organ that had made Margaret capable of love and kindness. This represents a form of cannibalistic thinking that was not uncommon among medieval nobles who had been raised to believe that they owned not just people's labor, but their very essence. The huntsman's substitution of an animal heart for Snow White's heart in the fairy tale was based on real practices among medieval contract killers. Professional assassins often found ways to avoid killing their targets, substituting animal organs for human ones, a common deception that relied on the client's inability to distinguish between different types of tissue. The ritual consumption of the heart in some versions of the story reflects actual practices among medieval Germanic nobles. There were documented cases of individuals consuming parts of their enemies' bodies, believing this would transfer the victim's strength or abilities to themselves. The evil stepmother's consumption of what she believed was Snow White's heart represents the ultimate expression of jealousy transformed into cannibalistic possession. The psychological impact of ordering such a murder cannot be understated. Katharina von Hatzfeld had crossed a line that separated normal human behavior from something far more disturbing. She had become what medieval society feared most, a person who had lost their humanity in pursuit of power and control. The demand for her stepdaughter's heart revealed that she no longer saw Margaret as a person, but as an object to be destroyed and consumed. The huntsman's role in the story also reflects the medieval understanding of moral responsibility. By hiring someone else to commit murder, Katharina believed she could avoid spiritual consequences for her actions. This was a common belief among medieval nobles, who thought that using intermediaries could protect them from divine punishment. The huntsman became a spiritual scapegoat, bearing the moral weight of actions ordered by someone else. The preservation and display of the false heart represents one of the most twisted aspects of the entire story. Katharina kept what she believed was Margaret's heart as a trophy, a permanent reminder of her victory over a rival. This behavior reveals a level of psychological pathology that modern forensic psychologists would recognize as consistent with the most disturbed serial killers. The real huntsman in Margaret's case was likely a professional killer hired through intermediaries to maintain Katharina's plausible deniability. Medieval Europe had developed sophisticated networks of assassins who specialized in making murders appear accidental or natural. These individuals operated with the tacit approval of authorities who understood that sometimes political or personal problems required permanent solutions. The heart's symbolic role in the story reflects the medieval understanding of human nature and spiritual warfare. The evil stepmother's demand for Snow White's heart was not just about proving death. It was about possessing the organ that represented everything she lacked: the capacity for love, kindness, and genuine human connection. By consuming her stepdaughter's heart, she hoped to literally consume these qualities and make them her own. The huntsman's heart in Snow White is not a symbol of mercy or redemption. It's a window into the darkest aspects of human nature and the psychological mechanisms that allow people to order the destruction of innocence. The most terrifying aspect of this story is not that it happened once, but that it represents a pattern of behavior that has repeated throughout human history. Snow White's story is not just about one murdered girl in medieval Germany. It's about the eternal human capacity for evil and the price paid by those who become targets of that evil.